But by committing himself to such a reckless strategy, he placed his entire southern wing in jeopardy and inadvertently ensured the destruction of the Axis alliance as a military force. In early December 1942, the German front west of Stalingrad ran along the line of the Upper Don and the River Chir. The front was held by two army groups. Army Group B in the northern sector consisted of the German Second Army, the Hungarian Second Army, and the Italian Eighth Army. Army Group Don in the south consisted of the 4th Panzer Army, supported by remnants of the 4th Romanian Army and 6th Army trapped in Stalingrad. The Soviet forces in the sector were deployed in 4 fronts. The Don and Stalingrad fronts, separating 6th Army from the rest of Army Group Don, and the Voronezh and Southwest fronts, facing Army Group B. In December and January, while 6th Army was slowly strangled in Stalingrad, the Soviet forces in the northern sector attacked across the Upper Don, demolishing in turn the Italian 8th Army and the Hungarian 2nd Army. These operations tore huge gaps in the front line and threatened a massive encirclement of the remaining Axis forces in the south. By the end of the month, these forces had fallen back to the Donets, abandoning 6th Army, together with all the territory won in the previous year. The fighting in Stalingrad came to an end on February the 2nd. Of the 320,000 German soldiers cut off in the encirclement, only a little over 100,000 remained to be taken prisoner. Most of the rest had been killed or had died slowly of frostbite and starvation. The loss of 6th Army in its entirety was a disaster for Germany, but the damage inflicted on the Axis was irreparable. Between November 1942 and February 1943, 3 Axis satellite armies had been utterly destroyed, and a 4th so badly damaged that it was soon disbanded. In March, before the spring thaws brought the fighting to a close, the Germans reorganized their command system in southern Russia, creating Army Group South out of the remnants of Army Groups A and Don, and dismantling Army Group B. In the same month, they recaptured Kharkov, which had fallen to the Russians in February. By the end of March, the front had stabilized. Both sides were exhausted and needed time to regroup and consolidate. But for Germany, the future was now bleak. Defeats in the East and in Africa had plunged the Axis into disarray and transformed Hitler's war of conquest into a battle for survival. The Anti-Comintern Pact, signed by Japan and Germany in 1936, and later by Italy, formed the basis for the military alliance later known as the Axis. A state visit by Hitler to Rome in 1938 further strengthened the bond between Italy and Germany, and helped prepare the ground for the military adventures of 1939. In 1940, after the fall of France, The Axis was joined by Hungary and Romania, and in the following year by Bulgaria. For Hitler, these alliances were essential to the security of the Reich and to the creation of a pan-European alliance against Bolshevism. They also lent legitimacy to the Nazi regime and helped to reassure the German people that they were not alone. The destruction of the Axis satellite armies in the East and in North Africa was therefore a political as well as a military disaster. Yet as far as he was able, Hitler would not desert his allies, nor would he allow them to desert him. In the summer of 1943, he would authorize plans to be drawn up for a German occupation of Italy. In August 1941, Mussolini dispatched 3 Italian divisions to fight alongside those of Germany, Hungary and Romania in the Soviet Union. In the same month, he travelled with Hitler to Brest-Litovsk to survey the devastation wrought on the Red Army during the battles on the frontier. Mussolini was impressed and fully accepted Hitler's assurance that the war in the East would be over by the spring of 1942. A year later, there were 10 Italian divisions fighting in Russia, and little prospect of a decisive victory in the foreseeable future. In Egypt, the German-Italian Panzer Army had been stopped in its tracks and forced onto the defensive. By now, Mussolini's fortunes and those of Italy herself were entirely dependent on those of Germany. The disasters that befell the Axis between November 1942 and May 1943 were therefore felt most heavily by Italy. All 10 Italian divisions in the East were destroyed, and a further 14 were lost in North Africa. Italian patience was wearing thin. In the summer, Mussolini would be deposed in a vain attempt to extricate Italy from the war. For Churchill, the victory at Alamein in November 1942 marked the end of a long period of defeat and humiliation for the British Army. Victory also restored his own political fortunes, which had fallen to their lowest ebb with the loss of Tobruk earlier that year, and the subsequent retreat of the Eighth Army through Egypt to the Alamein positions. With the final defeat of the Axis in Tunisia, Churchill's priority now was to consolidate and extend Allied power in the Mediterranean. His was the driving force behind British proposals for landings in Sicily and Italy. Behind this strategy lay concerns about long-term Soviet plans for Eastern and Central Europe. By knocking Italy out of the war, Churchill hoped to influence events in Central Europe to the Western Allies' advantage and secure Greece and the Balkans from Soviet intervention. It was this, essentially post-war strategy that most infuriated both Roosevelt and Stalin and led to serious disagreements that would fundamentally affect the conduct of the campaign. The series of setbacks suffered by the Americans in North Africa, culminating in the rough handling of the American Second Corps in central Tunisia, was a sobering experience for American planners and for Roosevelt. British doubts about the combat readiness